She was 36 years old, and by the autumn of 1891 she had exactly $4.60 to her name, a name that most of Cedar Hollow had already stopped bothering to remember. Her name was Mercy Tanner, and it was her own father-in-law, a hard, proud man named Aldous Reeve, who ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, who had turned her out of the small tenant house on his land the week after her husband Caleb died in a rock slide, telling her plainly that a widow with no sons and no cattle of her own had no further claim on Reeve land. She took what she could carry in a single flour sack, and after 2 nights sleeping in the loft of a sympathetic neighbor's barn, she went to the county courthouse where the abandoned Cold Water Forge, boarded shut for 9 years since old blacksmith Amos Whitlock had vanished without a trace, was being sold for whatever the county could get simply to be rid of the unpaid taxes on it. She paid $4 for it, all she had left in the world, and the men gathered outside the courthouse laughed and called it the foolish purchase of a foolish woman, a forge nobody could work, standing on land nobody wanted. What none of them knew, what Mercy herself did not yet know as she pushed open that stubborn, rust-bound door for the first time, was that buried deep in the cold ashes of that forge long-dead half lay a secret that had been waiting 9 years to be found, one that would not only lift her out of poverty but would return to the whole of Cedar Hollow a debt of honor it had never known it owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mercy Tanner. If you have ever been told that what you were building meant nothing, that the thing you were holding on to had no worth left in it at all, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Mercy had been born Mercy Dunlap in 1855 on a small farm outside Staunton, Virginia, the only daughter of a blacksmith named Elias Dunlap, a broad, patient man who had taught her, almost by accident, the trade that most fathers of his era would never have dreamed of teaching a daughter. It began simply enough, with Mercy carrying water and pumping the bellows as a girl of 7 or 8, too small yet to do anything but watch. But she watched with an attention that her father noticed and, in his own quiet way, encouraged, explaining to her as he worked exactly why iron behaved as it did, why it glowed a particular color at a particular heat, why a blade quenched too quickly would crack, and one quenched too slowly would never hold an edge at all. By the time she was 14, Mercy could shoe a horse competently, could mend a broken plow blade, could forge a serviceable hinge or latch. Skills she practiced not because her father needed the help, though he did, but because something in the discipline of the work, the exactness of it, the honesty of fire and hammer and iron, satisfied something in her that nothing else quite touched. Her mother, a gentle, worried woman named Ruth, fretted constantly that Mercy's callous hands and smoke-smudged apron would frighten away any respectable suitor, and it was, in fact, precisely those callous hands that first caught the attention of a young drover named Caleb Tanner, passing through Staunton with a cattle outfit bound west, who told her frankly that he had never met a woman who understood iron the way she did, and that he found it the most remarkable thing about her. They married in 1873, when Mercy was 18, and within the year they had followed Caleb's outfit west of the Wyoming Territory, settling at last in a narrow, fertile valley community called Cedar Hollow, where Caleb found steady work as a hand on the growing Reeve cattle operation, the largest in the valley, owned by a stern, ambitious man named Aldous Reeve. Mercy brought with her from Virginia not only her father's tools, carefully wrapped and carried the whole journey west, but also his lessons. And though there was already a small forge in Cedar Hollow run by an aging blacksmith named Amos Whitlock, she found ways, in those early years, to make herself useful, mending harness buckles and wagon fitting for neighbors too far from town to make the trip themselves, always for a fair price, never charging more than the work was worth even when she could have. It was during these years that she came to know Amos Whitlock himself, a solitary, careful man who had run Cedar Hollow's forge for 2 decades and who recognized in young Mercy Tanner a rare kindred understanding of the craft, teaching her, over long afternoons when Caleb was out with the herd, refinements of her father's methods that she had never learned in Virginia, particular techniques for tempering, for reading the color of a flame, for listening to the particular ring of well-worked iron. Amos had no family of his own, his wife having died young and childless, and there grew between the old blacksmith and the young farm wife something like the bond of a father and daughter who had chosen each other, a bond built entirely on mutual respect for careful, honest work. Life in Cedar Hollow was never easy, but for a decade it was good. Caleb steady in his work for Reeve, Mercy building a quiet reputation of her own for reliability and fair dealing, and though they never had children, a sorrow Mercy carried privately. They built together a small, contented home on a modest parcel of Reeves' land, granted to Caleb as part of his long service, though never formally deeded, a distinction that would matter a great deal in the years to come. Aldous Reeve himself was a man Mercy had never much trusted, ambitious and unyielding, the kind of man who measured every relationship by its usefulness to him, and though he tolerated Caleb well enough as a loyal and capable hand, he had never extended to Mercy anything warmer than cold courtesy. Resenting, she sometimes suspected that a woman in his valley could work iron as well as any man he employed. It was Amos Whitlock who once told her, in the quiet of his forge, that Aldous Reeve had not always been the richest man in Cedar Hollow, that there had been a time, before Mercer's arrival, when the valley's fortunes had been more evenly shared among its founding families, and that something had happened, some quiet shift in the valley's history, that Amos would only ever refer to obliquely, as though it were a wound he had promised someone he would not reopen. Mercer did not press him on it then, thinking there would be time enough later to ask, a mistake she would come to regret bitterly, for old Amos Whitlock disappeared from Cedar Hollow entirely in the autumn of 1882, his forge locked up tight, his few possessions left untouched inside, and no soul in the valley ever learned with certainty what had become of him, though rumors ranged from a sudden illness on the road to something darker that no one cared to say aloud in Aldous Reeve's hearing. The disaster that undid Mercer's own life came 9 years later, in the summer of 1891, when Caleb, working a routine job clearing a rock fall from Reeves up a grazing trail, was caught beneath a second slide that no one could have predicted and died before he could be carried back down to the valley floor. Mercer's grief was total, but she had little time to indulge it, for within a week of Caleb's burial, Aldous Reeve himself rode to the small tenant house where she and Caleb had lived for 18 years and informed her, with the same cold courtesy he had always shown her, that the house and land had never been legally his, that Caleb's death ended whatever informal arrangement had existed, and that she would need to vacate within the fortnight to make way for a new hand in his family. Mercy asked, with as much composure as he could muster, whether 18 years of Caleb's loyal service counted for nothing at all, and Aldous Reeve told her, without apparent shame, that business was business, and that a woman with no sons to inherit her husband's position had, in the end, nothing further to offer the Reeve operation. She did not argue further, understanding that there was no argument that would move a man who had already decided the matter was settled, and she spent her final days in the house packing what little she owned, her father's forging tools chief among them, into a single flour sack in a small trunk, leaving behind furniture and belongings she had no way to carry and no money to store. She spent 2 nights in the hayloft of a kindly neighbor, a widow named Sarah Croft, who fed her supper both nights and asked no questions she did not want answered, and it was Sarah who first mentioned, almost in passing, that the county was finally auctioning off old Amos Whitlock's forge, abandoned now for 9 years, the back taxes on having piled up past any sensible person's willingness to pay them. Mercy went to the courthouse steps the following morning less out of any real plan than out of a stubborn refusal to simply vanish quietly from the valley the way Aldous Reeve seemed to expect of her, and when the county clerk read out the terms, noting that the county would forgive the taxes entirely to anyone willing to take the derelict building off its hands, Mercy found herself stepping forward before she had fully decided to, offering the $4.60 that constituted the whole of her worldly wealth. A few of the men gathered there for other business laughed, one of them remarking that a widow blacksmith buying a haunted forge was surely the strangest thing Cedar Hollow had seen in years, for the notion had taken hold sometime after Amos's disappearance that his forge was cursed or haunted, an idea Mercy had never put much stock in but which had kept away any other bidder for 9 long years. The clerk, eager to be rid of the property and its unpaid taxes, brought down his gavel without much ceremony, and Mercy Tanner walked away from the courthouse the owner of a boarded, silent forge that everyone else in the valley considered worthless. The building itself, when she finally forced its swollen door open with a borrowed pry bar, released a breath of stale air, cold ash, and a particular metallic tang that lingers in any place where iron has been worked for decades. Amos Whitlock had left the forge, it seemed, in a hurry, or under some duress, for his tools still hung on the pegs along the wall, rusted now with 9 years of neglect, and his anvil still stood in its place, and the great stone hearth at the center of the room was heaped with cold ash that had simply been left to sit undisturbed since whatever final day Amos had worked that fire. Mercy spent her first days simply clearing the wreckage, sweeping out 9 years of dust and the leavings of nesting birds, oiling what tools could still be saved, and it was on her third day, while shoveling out the deep bed of cold ash from the hearth itself in preparation for lighting the forge fresh, that her shovel struck something solid buried deep beneath the ash, something that rang with a dull metallic note quite unlike stone. She knelt and dug carefully with her bare hands, and drew from the ashes a small iron strongbox, its surface pitted with age but its hinges, remarkably, still sound, clearly built by craftsmen who understood how to protect a thing from fire and time both. It was locked, but the lock was old and simple, and a woman who had spent her life working iron had little trouble persuading it open with a bent wire and patient hands, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the worst of the ash and damp at bay, she found a leather journal filled with Amos Whitlock's own careful handwriting, a small pouch of gold coin, older and heavier than any currency then common in the valley, and a folded deed, brittle but legible, bearing the name of a mining claim Mercy had never heard mentioned in all her years in Cedar Hollow. She carried her find to the one clear corner of the workbench and, by the fading light of late afternoon, began to read, and what she found in those pages was not merely an old man's private hoard, but the buried truth of exactly why Amos Whitlock had vanished 9 years before, and why Aldous Reeve had built his fortune so much faster than any of his neighbors in that same span of years. Amos's journal explained that in the early years of Cedar Hollow's settlement, before Aldous Reeve had built his cattle empire, the valley's families had jointly discovered and worked a modest silver seam in the high country above the valley, an operation small enough that it never drew outside attention but productive enough that it proceeds, divided fairly among the founding families under an informal partnership, had for several years given every household in Cedar Hollow, including the Whitlocks and the Dunlaps of Mercer's own acquaintance by marriage, and yes, the Reeves as well, a modest but real prosperity. Aldous Reeve, then a younger and hungrier man serving as the partnership's bookkeeper by virtue of his better schooling, had grown convinced that he alone deserved the greatest share of the claimed proceeds, and had, over a period of several years documented meticulously in Amos's own hand, quietly falsified the partnership's records, diverting an ever larger portion of the silver's value into his own accounts under cover of manufactured expenses and fabricated shipping losses, slowly, starving his partners of a fortune that was rightfully theirs while using the diverted wealth to buy up grazing land and cattle, until his operation dwarfed anything his former partners could match. Amos, who had kept his own private accounting of the claim's true output as an old habit of careful record-keeping, had discovered the discrepancy sometime in 1881, and had confronted Reeve privately, hoping, in his own words, to shame the man into quietly making restitution rather than expose him publicly and shatter what remained of the valley's trust in itself. Reeve had instead threatened him, subtly but unmistakably, and within a year Amos had grown genuinely afraid, not merely for his forge but for his life, and had begun, in secret, gathering proof, copying the true claim records, securing a portion of the silver's rightful proceeds that Reeve had tried to seize entirely for himself, and hiding both the proof and the coin in the one place he trusted no one would think to search, buried deep in the cold ashes of his own hearth, meaning to bring the matter before the territorial authorities once he had gathered enough evidence to make the case unassailable. His final journal entry, dated only days before his disappearance, recorded that Reeve had somehow learned Amos was gathering proof against him, and that Amos intended to leave Cedar Hollow quietly for a time until he could safely present his case from a distance, trusting that if anything befell him, whoever eventually found his hidden cash would understand what it meant and would see that Cedar Hollow's true history was finally set right. Mercy sat with that journal long into the night, the forge cold and dark around her, and understood with a slow, sickening clarity that Amos Whitlock had very likely not simply vanished 9 years before, but had been silenced, one way or another, by the very man who had turned her out of her own home not 2 weeks past, and that the fortune Aldous Reeve had built his cattle empire upon was not the fruit of shrewd business sense at all, as the whole valley believed, but the theft of a partnership that had once included her own late husband's employer's predecessors, and, through the tangled threads of Cedar Hollow's small society, family she had known and traded with for 18 years. She understood, too, the danger of what she now possessed, for a man capable of silencing an old blacksmith to protect his fortune would hardly hesitate to move against a penniless widow with no standing in the valley and no one, save perhaps Sarah Croft, who would think to ask after her as she too simply disappeared. She did not act rashly. She had learned patience from her father at the forge, the discipline of letting iron reach exactly the right heat before ever striking it, and she resolved to gather her own proof, quietly and carefully, before she made any move that Aldous Reeve might notice. She began by seeking out the surviving members of Cedar Hollow's founding families, discovering that more of them remained than she had realized, elderly now or their children grown, families who had simply accepted over the years that their fortunes had never matched Reeves due to some vague notion of his superior business acumen, never suspecting the truth Amos's journal now revealed. She found Eliza Merrow, daughter of one of the original Silver Partnership's members, an elderly widow herself now living modest on the valley's northern edge, who confirmed to Mercy, once she saw Amos's careful handwriting and recognized her own late father's name in his account, that her family had always found it strange how quickly their share of the claimed proceeds had dwindled in those years, though her father had never lived to question it aloud. She found old Thaddeus Croft, Sarah's late husband's uncle, still sharp despite his years, who remembered the silver claim clearly and confirmed that Aldous Reeve had indeed kept the partnership's books in those years, a detail the Valley's collective memory had simply let fade with time. Piece by piece, working in the evenings after a day spent restoring the forge itself to something like working order, both to earn what little income she could and to maintain the appearance of an ordinary widow simply trying to survive, Mercer built a case far larger than Amos's journal alone, corroborated now by the memories of 3 surviving families and the gold coin itself, which Eliza Merrow recognized as matching a small remaining cash her own father had kept as proof of the claims' original value. It was inevitable that word would eventually reach Aldous Reeve that the widow Tanner was asking old families pointed questions about the Valley's early silver claim, and he came to see her himself on a cold afternoon in late October, standing in the doorway of the forge with the same cold courtesy he had always shown her, though something harder moved behind his eyes now. He suggested, in a tone that struck her as carefully rehearsed, that whatever old rumors she might be chasing was surely nothing more than an old man's confused ramblings, and that a widow with no resources and no standing would do well to abandon such inquiries before she found herself with even less than she currently possessed. When Mercer did not immediately yield, his tone shifted into something closer to threat, and he reminded her, quite plainly, that the whole Valley's goodwill toward her had always depended, whether she realized it or not, on his own tolerance, and that tolerance, he assured her, was not infinite. Mercy thanked him for his visit with a composure she did not fully feel, and after he left she understood that she had very little time now before he would move to protect himself by whatever means necessary, and that whatever she meant to do, she would need to do it soon and do it in the open, where he could not simply make her disappear the way she now believed he had made Amos Whitlock disappear 9 years before. She sent word to the Territorial Land Office in the county seat, requesting a formal review of the original Silver Claims Partnership records, and rather than traveling alone where she might easily be turned away or was, she traveled with Eliza Merrow and Thaddeus Croft beside her, each carrying their own family's memory of the arrangement, presenting together a case that could not easily be dismissed as one bitter widow's fantasy. The territorial clerk who received them, a careful, unhurried man named Josiah Pratt, took the matter seriously from the start, recognizing in Amos Whitlock's meticulous journal the hand of a man who had kept honest books his whole life, and he opened a formal inquiry into the original claims proceeds, summoning Aldous Reeve himself to answer for the discrepancies. Reeve arrived at the hearing with his usual composure, prepared, it seemed, to dismiss the whole matter as a confused imaginings of an old blacksmith who had likely wandered off and died somewhere in the high country years ago, but he had not anticipated the gold coin itself, matched precisely to samples Eliza Merrow still possessed from her father's original share. Nor had he anticipated that Josiah Pratt would send for the territory's own mining assay records from that period, records that confirmed the claimed true silver output had been very nearly double what Reeve had ever reported to his partners. Faced with Amos's journal, the corroborating memory of 3 founding families, matched physical evidence in the gold itself, and now the territory's own independent records contradicting his old reports, Aldous Reeve's composure finally cracked, and under careful questioning from Josiah Pratt, he admitted, haltingly and with evident fury at being cornered, that he had indeed adjusted the partnership's records in his own favor those many years ago, though he insisted, without much conviction, that he had done nothing that any sensible businessman would not have done in his place. The territorial authority ruled that Aldous Reeve owed restitution to surviving founding families and their heirs equal to the diverted proceeds, calculated with interest across the intervening decade, a sum substantial enough that it required him to sell off a significant portion of his cattle holdings to satisfy the judgment, and though he never faced formal charges regarding Amos Whitlock's disappearance itself, for no body was ever found and no direct proof of foul play could be, Established beyond Amos's own fearful final journal entries, the whole of Cedar Hollow now understood plainly what manner of man had built his fortune among them, and the quiet, unquestioning respect he had commanded for 2 decades evaporated within a single season. Mercy took no particular satisfaction in watching Reeve's cattle empire diminish, understanding, as her father had once taught her at his own forge, that a person ought to take pride in the work of setting a thing right rather than in the misfortune of the one who had wronged them. But she did insist, and Josiah Pratt agreed, that a portion of the restitution be set aside specifically to formally deed to her. At last, the small tenant house and land where she and Caleb had lived for 18 years, a modest but rightful acknowledgment of her husband's long, honest service to a man who had never deserved it. With her own share of the restored silver proceeds, modest as it was once divided fairly among all the founding family's heirs, Mercy did what she believed old Amos Whitlock himself would have wanted done, and rebuilt the Cold Water Forge not merely as her own trade, but as a working memorial to the honest craftsman who had died protecting the truth, restocking its tools, repairing its hearth, and opening it once more to the whole of Cedar Hollow as a place where fair dealing and careful work still mattered more than any man's ambition. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began. A widow of 36, cast out with $4.60, buying for that same small sum affords a whole valley considered haunted and worthless, buried beneath 9 years of cold ash and quiet grief. Mercy Tanner never forgot the sound of that laughter outside the courthouse, and she never forgot, either, the patient lessons her father had taught her at his own forge in Virginia, that iron reveals its true strength only under exactly the right pressure and heat, and that people, much like iron, so often reveal their truest worth only once everyone else has already decided they have none left to give. Amos Whitlock had hidden his proof in the ashes not out of fear alone but out of faith. Faith that someday someone honest enough to dig through the cold and forgotten would find it and know precisely what to do, and Mercy had honored that faith not by keeping the silver for herself, though she had needed it badly, but by using it to return to an entire valley the honest history it had quietly lost. What the ashes did shocked the whole of Cedar Hollow, not merely because it uncovered a theft 9 years buried, but because it returned to that valley the plain, simple truth that the humblest, most overlooked things, an old blacksmith's forge, a widow's callous hands, a bed of cold ashes nobody thought worth sifting through, so often hold within them exactly what a community has been quietly waiting, without even knowing it, to recover. Thank you for spending this time with Mercy Tanner and the town of Cedar Hollow tonight. If her story stayed with you, we hope you will share it with someone who needs reminding that patience and honest work are never truly wasted, however long they must wait to be seen. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off as worthless. Take care of one another, and take care of the quiet, overlooked corners of your own life where something honest might still be waiting. Until next time, stay close.